Designing navigation options starting with mobile. One of the great things when you design for mobile is that there's actually a reasonably limited number of design conventions as far as your application's navigation options. And there's even fewer options when it comes to trying to find a design for navigation which scales from mobile to tablet to desktop. And so this actually makes your decisions much easier to start with mobile, and that's why I would encourage that as opposed to starting with desktop. And so what we'll look at today is 4 different design patterns for navigation: on page, bottom tab, top tab, and side navigation drawer, and then look at how these can be and cannot be combined. When you look at on-page navigation, there's really probably one of the most common types of navigation used for the primary navigational structure on most applications. There's different variations. You can either have this being done, for instance, with on-page buttons, which would be common, or you could have this done with rows. And rows is probably one of the most common things you see. I mean, most messaging applications, if you look, for instance, on iMessage, really the only navigation entity you have is the rows, which are your different messages. It's also common to tile several large cards across the on-page navigation, or, I'll bundle into this group as well. A floating action button could also be thought of as a on-page primary navigation, which moves you from one major space of the application to another major space of the application. The second major type of navigational structure is the bottom tab. And over the last few years, most applications have really been moving towards a bottom tab navigation. And there's at least 8 good reasons for this. The first, that bottom tabs are easier to reach with your thumb on mobile phones. And this is important as most phones are getting larger now. And the other advantage, of course, is if you are looking at this on a tablet, you don't obscure your screen when reaching across the tablet with your hand to select a button if it, for instance, was on the top. And so that's one of the advantages of the bottom tab. The bottom tab also makes it very clear at all times to know which part of the app you're in. And knowing exactly where in the application you are is really essential for a good experience. The bottom tabs also make it possible to know what the other major spaces of the application are. And so this would encourage users to explore. The bottom tab provides the ability to push focused notifications. So that would be, for instance, alerts for new messages, which can be targeted to the specific major space that they come from, and which would, of course, be indicated on the respective bottom tab button. The bottom tab also accommodates up to 5 tabs on mobile, which should be enough for most simple applications. It scales really nicely on desktop. As you can see in the diagrams, when you get to a desktop, essentially that bottom tab row can be shifted to the left to occupy a left navigation bar. And it's also easy to embed an action button or a primary action button directly into that app bar. So you can replace one of the tabs with one of the intended actions that you want to trigger something. Now, probably the largest downside is that the application can't have more than 5 main bottom tabs. And so if you have an application which is more complicated, really you can't use a bottom tab bar to occupy those major spaces. You'd have to do something really funky, such as turning one of the tabs into a more button, which would then mean that if you click that button, it takes you to a screen where you can access more major spaces within your application, or you would have to use the bottom tabs in a sliding fashion, but that's really not used as much. And so there remains a little bit of debate about whether the bottom navigation tabs need to persist across all the screens of the app, but I haven't really fully looked into that to know exactly the best answer. We move now into the top tab navigation, and there's a lot of advantages here. The top tab navigation looks good if you have 2 tabs, it looks good with 3 tabs, it looks good with 5 tabs, and it can easily scale to accommodate really as many tabs as you want because the extra tabs overflow off screen. And if you increase the screen size, such as you go from mobile to tablet or tablet to desktop, those extra tabs which were previously overflowing on the smaller device come into view. And of course, you can scrub back and forth on that row of overflown tabs if you're on a mobile to pull them into view. The navigation tabs also allow you to use text, which is a reasonably large size, to indicate what that tab represents, and anything which can move you towards large, clear text for your navigation is a plus. And one of the other advantages by moving the navigation to the top of the application is that your information hierarchy is extremely clear. The navigation tab is at the top, and then its respective content is underneath it. Now, the major downside to this pattern is that the tabs are hard to reach with your finger when you're on a mobile phone, right? Because they're at the top of the screen. And so the workaround for this really is to make it so that if the user clicks on any of the content in the screen and swipes towards the left or towards the right, that gesture is connected to changing their position in the top navigation tab bar. And so a really good example would be, for instance, in the Twitter application, that you can shift between different parts of a user's profile page just by swiping left and right, and then that controls the tabs at the top of the screen. We move now on to the side navigation drawer, which is the fourth main pattern. This is sometimes called a hamburger menu. And I'm really happy to see that finally most applications have moved away from the hamburger menu as their means of primary navigation between an application's major spaces. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, there are benefits to this navigation panel, and some of those would be that you can have really an unlimited number of navigation buttons in it, that you can display a long text name for each of them, that there's even space for an icon, and there's even space for additional information, such as the number of unread messages in that for that button. But the problem is that when you want to change between major spaces in your application, it's always going to require 2 clicks. You're always going to have to launch the side drawer on a mobile device and then select the particular button. And the other problem is that when you load the application for the first time, that side drawer really is going to be closed. And so it's not always obvious that you have to open the side drawer to operate an application. And you really don't know what you're missing if you don't open the side menu. And so this is one of those cases of unknown unknowns where the user doesn't know that they need to open the menu and they don't know what they don't know is inside the menu. And this is, of course, the benefit of moving to the bottom tabs, as most applications have, where it's very clear at all times when you load the application of the major spaces contained inside. One of the other problems is that it's really hard to display notifications and nudge the user to other parts of the application. For instance, when you have the bottom tabs, as we were discussing, you can indicate on each bottom tab a particular value, for instance, unread messages. But when this is all contained behind a hamburger menu, you can only indicate on the hamburger menu that there's a notification, and therefore you're grouping all the notifications across all the different tabs in that menu into one single icon. And of course, the last problem is that the hamburger button is far away to click. And you can get around this by swiping from the left of the screen inward. But if you're running this on a web browser on your mobile phone, that swiping gesture would actually move you back a page. And so that's one of the problems. Very briefly, we can look at some ways you can combine these navigation patterns. The first is that you can pretty much combine the on-page navigation or the hamburger or sidebar navigation panel with any other pattern. They're, for the most part, pretty versatile to be able to combine safely. You can also pair, for the most part, a top and a bottom navigation panel. When you're looking at this on mobile, The bottom navigation tabs really are the primary navigation, and then the top tab becomes the secondary navigation. And when you shift this to desktop, that bottom tabs move over to the left part of the desktop into a vertical row. And it also is acceptable to pair together two top tab navigations, as long as the most top of those two tabs is slightly larger and clearly the dominant and the primary navigation. It is okay to have a tab menu structure underneath it. Obviously, this could be done very poorly, but generally this can be done well. And then the thing which you probably should always avoid is the pairing of two bottom tab navigations on top of each other. It becomes very difficult to know which is the primary navigation because, it's just hard to tell. Are we still using the very most bottom of these two rows to be the primary, or is it the top one above the two rows, which is the primary? And so that's a pattern which really should never be used. Anyway, that's a brief overview, and of course this will be used in a later post when we want to influence and understand the ways which we have to arrange a patient medical chart.